Good to meet you all. I'm thankful for the opportunity to come down. I'm thankful that you all invited me to come down here. I've heard about this group for a while, but haven't had the opportunity to come. Let's see if we can get this to work. But I'm thankful to be able to come down and be with you all. You can open your Bibles to 2 Chronicles, chapter 17. That's where we're going to get started here in just a second. 2 Chronicles 17. For those of y'all that I haven't met yet, like was said, my name is Jonathan Sadler. I live up near the Gettysburg area and worship with the church up there, and work there with Scott Smelser. And so I think you all know Scott and definitely know his father Dale, working here with a while. The Smelsers are very dear to me now, and I know that they're very dear to you as well. But I'm thankful to be able to be here. It's always an encouragement for me, and I want to start by letting you all know that you all have encouraged me today. It's an encouragement for me to get to travel around. I'm still pretty young. I'm 24 years old, so I haven't met everyone, and I haven't been everywhere. But almost everywhere that I've been in the country so far, there have been a group of people that are trying to serve the Lord, and that really love Him, really want to do His will. And it's so encouraging every time that I meet new people that want to do that. So thank you all for shining your lights here, for being that encouragement for me. And I've loved getting to sing with you all today and pray with you all. It's been an encouragement for me so far. And I hope that what we have to talk about today will be encouraging for you as well. In 2 Chronicles 17, up there it says chapter 20, but we're going to start in 17. I want to discuss this quote that comes up in chapter 20, where there's a man that says, "We do not know what to do." That's really a kind of terrifying feeling. Is there anybody in this room that enjoys not knowing what to do? That's not a good feeling to have. I don't like not knowing what to do. I like knowing where I'm going to be. If you all could look into my phone and look into my schedule and my calendar, I have planned out for months in advance where I'm going to be, what I'm going to do. I set multiple reminders that I'm coming down here so that I know I'm going to be here to do that. I like knowing where I'm going to be, what I'm going to do, how it's going to happen, who's going to be there. The fact of the matter is, life doesn't always work that way. We don't always know what to do. We don't always know what's going to happen. We don't always know where we're going to be in certain life situations. And what gets really scary sometimes, it's scary when we have that feeling, but it's also scary when people that we respect, or maybe people in positions of leadership, don't know what to do. Because the leader is supposed to know what to do. And if the leader doesn't know what to do, what are the followers going to do? That can be a terrifying feeling to have. And so I want to talk about that, and I want to discuss a man who is a leader in the Bible here in 2 Chronicles that experienced this feeling of not knowing what to do. And we're just going to look at him as kind of a character study and see what he did and use him as kind of the example for what we need to do when we encounter situations in our lives that are just hard or difficult and we feel like we don't have the answers. Where do we go? And so that man is Jehoshaphat, King Jehoshaphat, in 2 Chronicles chapter 17. I want to just look at who Jehoshaphat is in 2 Chronicles 17. He's the king of Judah. And so you remember that when God allowed the nation of Israel to have a king, God wanted to be their king, but Israel wanted to have a king outside of God. And so God granted that to them, and he also made provisions for that in the law. But he granted King Saul to be their king. And so you have the United Kingdom. King Saul is the first king, and he started out okay. He was a humble man in his beginnings, but over time started trusting in himself, becoming more arrogant and going farther and farther away from God, until finally God took the kingdom from him and then turned it over to the man after God's own heart, who was King David. And then King David reigned, and God established his kingdom forever, and King Solomon, his son, reigned after him and built the temple and filled that part one of the covenant that God made for David. But Solomon, near the end of his life, started kind of falling off. And he started not trusting in God and started seeking after all kinds of other things in the world, marrying foreign wives and seeking help from Egypt and different things like that. And so God said he's going to take the kingdom from Solomon. But he didn't take it from Solomon for the sake of David. Instead, he prolonged it for a generation, and Solomon's son Rehoboam, who was not a wise king, lost 10/12 of the kingdom. And so 10 tribes went with Jeroboam to the north in Israel. 2 tribes went with Rehoboam to the south in Judah. And there's the divided kingdom. And you know, Israel had no good kings. They were all evil. All of them followed in the sins of Jeroboam and idolatry and the 2 calves that were established in Dan and Bethel, the northern part, southern part of Israel. And so they were all bad. But Judah had some good kings. They had a lot of bad kings, but they had some good kings, some kings that followed in the path of David. And Asa was kind of the first one that kind of spearheaded that. He really kind of helped Judah get back on track and start following God. And after him, the next good king was Jehoshaphat. And so we read about him in chapter 17 of 2 Chronicles. We'll start in verse 1. It says, Jehoshaphat, his son, reigned in his place and strengthened himself against Israel. And he placed forces in all the fortified cities of Judah, set garrisons in the land of Judah and in the cities of Ephraim that Asa his father had captured. And the Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the earlier ways of his father David. He did not seek the Baals, but sought the God of his fathers and walked in his commandments, and not according to the practices of Israel. Therefore the Lord established his kingdom in his hand, and all Judah brought tribute to Jehoshaphat, and he had great riches and honor. And his heart was courageous in the ways of the Lord, and furthermore he took the high places and the Asherim out of Judah. We see Jehoshaphat continuing what Asa started in destroying idolatry and in really seeking God. He was a good king for a lot of ways, but I think the first way was he got rid of the sin. The major sin that Judah was struggling with and that Israel struggled with during the period of the kings was idolatry. We don't really read a whole lot about idolatry in the New Testament. The Jews seem to not really have an issue with that in the New Testament. There was more hypocrisy and following the traditions and things like that. But idolatry was a real issue here. And so Jehoshaphat gets rid of that. He continues to take those out. But then look down in verse 7 of this same chapter. That's not all that he did. In verse 7 it says, in the 3rd year of his reign, he sent his officials, Benhal and Obadiah and Zechariah and Nethano and Micaiah to teach the cities of Judah. And with them the Levites, Shemaiah, Nethaniah, Zebediah, Asael, Shemarath, Jehanathon, Adonijah, Tobijah, and Tobadonijah, and with these the Levites and the priest Elishama and Jehoram. And they taught in Judah, having the book of the law of the Lord with them. They went through all the cities of Judah and taught among the people. So he didn't just stop by taking the evil out. He started putting the good back in. It was commanded by God that his king was supposed to take the law and he was supposed to write the law and to read it daily. And I don't know if, to my knowledge, I don't think there's a king that we have recorded that does that, but there are a fair amount of kings that are very concerned with the law of the Lord. And I would imagine that Jehoshaphat, if he's concerned with his people learning the law of the Lord, he was concerned learning the law of the Lord as well. And so he's a good king in that way. But then also in chapter 18, chapter 17 begins with Jehoshaphat kind of strengthening himself against Israel, and there's kind of a civil war going on between Israel and Judah during his reign. But he establishes a new relationship with Israel. In chapter 18 and verse 1, Jehoshaphat had great riches and honor, and he made a marriage alliance with King Ahab. And he's the king of Israel at the time of Jehoshaphat. And we'll talk about that alliance here in just a second. So he was a good political king. Not only did he get the people back to God, he had good policies and he helped them have peace and things like that during his reign. But I love this part in chapter 19. Chapter 19, starting in verse 4. It says, Jehoshaphat lived in Jerusalem. And he went out again, and the people from Beersheba to the hill country of Ephraim, and he brought them back to the Lord, the God of their fathers. And he appointed judges in the land, in all the fortified cities of Judah, city by city. And he said to the judges, consider what you do, for you judge not for man, but for the Lord. He is with you in giving judgment. Now then, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Be careful what you do, for there is no injustice with the Lord our God, or partiality, or taking bribes. And so what Jehoshaphat really cares about here is the justice of God. We were studying in Zechariah, and we also mentioned earlier this morning in Micah, in the prophets, what are some of the things that the Lord requires, the base requirements of the Lord? To do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with God. That's Jehoshaphat. He wants to do justice. He wants to follow God. He is a good man and a good king. We could even say he's an extraordinary king. I like that word. It's a really simple word, really simple compound word. It's just two words put together, ordinary and extra, right? Jehoshaphat was not just ordinary like all the other kings. He did what was required of him as a king, but he kind of went above and beyond, which is what God called the king to do, to go above and beyond and make the people, show the people that they needed to seek God. And it's a really great story of Jehoshaphat and how he starts out and keeps strengthening the nation of Israel. But then we get to chapter 20, and then oppression comes. And so in chapter 20, in verse 1 and 2, it says, after this, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and with them some of the Meunites came against Jehoshaphat for battle. And some of the men came and told Jehoshaphat, a great multitude is coming against you from Edom and beyond the sea, and behold, they are in Hazazon Tamar, that is in Gedi. And so, isn't that how our life works a lot of times? Things are going really good, we're doing what we're supposed to do, we're following God, we're trying to get other people to follow God, and then something unexpected or bad happens. It's kind of a similar pattern that happens all the time. Even with Jesus, it happened there. Jesus was following God's will, and he went and he was baptized to fulfill all righteousness, as he says in the gospel accounts, and then immediately after that, he goes and he's tempted by Satan. It's like right after something good happens, there's something bad that happens. And that's how it happens a lot of times in our lives. And I think we just need to get used to that and expect that. Peter will talk about that in 1 Peter chapter 4. He says, don't think it's strange whenever you encounter various trials that come upon you. Trials are going to happen. Hard things will happen. They have a purpose, we read about in the Bible, but they do happen. And sometimes they happen right after good things. And that's what happened with Jehoshaphat. But how does he respond? I think he responds exactly how you would expect a righteous king to respond. He seeks God. And so in verse 3, continuing in chapter 20, in verse 3, then Jehoshaphat was afraid, and he set his face to seek the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah, and Judah assembled to seek help from the Lord, and from the cities of Judah they came to seek the Lord. And so he does exactly what you'd expect. He himself seeks the Lord. I like that phrase that it says, he set his face to seek the Lord. But he didn't just stop at him seeking the Lord. He got everyone else around him to seek the Lord. That's really kind of maybe point number one that I don't have up on my PowerPoint. But what we need to realize when bad things happen and when you don't know what to do, seek the Lord and help other people to seek the Lord with you. Because the Lord will have the answers. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But that's kind of the first step that Jehoshaphat does. And so he proclaims a fast. And this idea of fasting, all the people are giving up the food and they're really focusing, making a joint effort to beg God for help. But I don't want to talk about the fast really this morning. We could spend time talking about that. I want to talk about Jehoshaphat's prayer. Because I think in the next few verses, this is one of the most beautiful prayers I think that's recorded in the entire Bible. I love this prayer. And so I have it up here on the screen. This is from the ESV, but you can read it from your Bible as well. In verse 5, it says, and Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord, before the new court, and he said, O Lord, God of our fathers, are you not God in heaven? You rule over all of the kingdoms and nations. In your hand are power and might, so that none is able to withstand you. Did you not, our God, drive out the inhabitants of the land before your people Israel, and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham your friend? And they have lived in it and have built for you in it a sanctuary for your name, saying, if disaster comes upon us, the sword, judgment, or pestilence or famine, we will stand before you, before this house and before you, for your name is in this house, and cry out to you in our affliction, and you will hear and save. And now behold, the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir, whom you would not let Israel invade when they came from the land of Egypt, and whom they avoided and did not destroy, behold, they reward us by coming to drive us out of your possession, which you have given us to inherit. And verse 12, here's the important what I want to focus on this morning. O our God, will you not execute judgment on them? For we are powerless against this great horde that is coming against us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. I like that statement, that last verse. We are powerless against this great horde that's coming against us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. And so I want to focus on those three statements in verse 12 with Jehoshaphat. That first one, he says, we're powerless. That seems kind of strange to me that Jehoshaphat would say that, given the type of kingdom that Jehoshaphat has. Because it seems like he's forgetting 2 Chronicles chapter 17. Look back just a couple of chapters to chapter 17, when it's describing Jehoshaphat's reign. In verse 10, it says, the fear of the Lord fell upon all of the kingdoms and the lands who were around Judah, and they made no war against Jehoshaphat. Everyone that's around Jehoshaphat's afraid because Judah at this time, Judah is powerful, and they don't want to mess with Judah anymore. And you look down, we're not going to read all of these verses, but you look through, starting around in verse 14, the numbers when it's naming the army that Jehoshaphat has. There's numbers like 300,000, 280,000, 200,000, 180,000, and it mentions all of those men that are under Jehoshaphat's reign. When you add all of those together, you get well over 1 million soldiers. But that's not all that Jehoshaphat has. In the last verse of the chapter, It says, these were in the service of the king, besides those whom the king had placed in the fortified cities throughout all Judah. All of these that are mentioned here, that's not all that Jehoshaphat has. He has a big army, a powerful army, and all the people around him realize that, and they're afraid of that. So why does he say we're powerless when this horde's coming against him? I think it's because he understands a very basic principle that's talked about actually in Zechariah. In Zechariah chapter 4, keep your finger here, we'll be right back in 2 Chronicles. But look at Zechariah chapter 4, in verse 6. The Lord is talking, and he says, then he said to me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord of hosts. I think Jehoshaphat understood that it doesn't matter how many people he has in his army, if God's not with him, he's powerless. And so he got that, and he acknowledged that firsthand, and that's vitally important for the king to know, that no matter how many people he has on his side, if God's not on his side, it's futile. And so he was powerless without God. And that kind of leads to the second thing that he says, where he says, we don't know what to do. And he turns over the plan, I guess, to God. Imagine that you're in Jehoshaphat's army when this is happening. I picture sometimes when this is happening, when it describes a great horde, sometimes we see in like war movies or things like that, where there's this evil army that's coming and there's dark clouds and they're wearing all like the black armor and there's millions and millions of them and it's kind of a terrifying situation and the good army is just surrounded by them and it seems kind of hopeless. Imagine if in one of those movie scenes, all of the soldiers are looking to the leader, looking to the king, and he turns around and he just says, guys, I don't know what to do. That would be heartbreaking. That would be terrifying. Imagine if our president said something like that. If America were attacked by another country, or a group of countries, like what's happening to Jehoshaphat, and they were coming and attacking us, and the president got on and he gave an address to the nation, and all he said was, I just don't know what to do. How would we feel? We think, we need to get out of there. We need to get someone in here that knows what to do, because we have a war that's coming. But what Jehoshaphat illustrates here is that he's trusting in God. He's trusting that God knows what to do, and that if God's on our side, because we're powerless without God, God knows what to do and we can turn it over to him, which is the last statement that he makes, because leaders are supposed to have a plan. He says, our eyes are on you. That's great faith to have, especially as a leader, I think. Whenever something bad or difficult happens in our lives, just to say, I'm going to look to God. And to show other people that you need to look to God. And so that's what Jehoshaphat does. That's what his story is. And his story ends very well. They have victory over the foreign kings that are coming against him. But I want to look at some applications for ourselves with those three things. Those three statements that Jehoshaphat makes, I think, can directly apply for us when we get in situations where we don't know what to do. And so, number one, the first thing that we need to do and how we need to apply those types of things to our life is we need to be honest about our circumstances. Whenever there's something that happens in our life, we need to be honest about the circumstance that we're in. You know, the fact of the matter is, God knows that we can't handle things by ourselves. He knows that. He's aware of that. But sometimes we just need to say it, more so I think to remind us that we need God and that we can't do it without God. I think there are a lot of different groups of people that use this type of strategy. Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, says that the first step to overcoming alcoholism is to acknowledge that you have a problem. I think that kind of is true for the life of a Christian. If we don't acknowledge that we're in a difficult situation and we try to blind ourselves to the situation that we're in, we're never going to seek help from God in the first place. So first we need to be honest about the circumstance that we find ourselves in. If there's a difficult thing to deal with in our lives, it's healthy and right, and it's true to say without God, we're powerless in that situation. And that leads to the second kind of thing. We need to confess that we're insufficient. Without God, once we're honest about our circumstance, we need to confess that we're insufficient without God. I enjoy knowing what to do. I like knowing what my plans are. I like knowing where things are going to end up, even if it's a difficult situation. Sometimes, I know a friend, one of my friends was in the hospital last week or two weeks ago, I think. And they were going back and forth and they just going to different doctors and none of the doctors knew what was going on. They were having kind of severe abdominal pains and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And she said to me, you know, I wish somebody would just tell me what was wrong. I don't even really want them to fix it. I just want to know what's wrong. And oftentimes that happens in our lives as Christians. We don't even really want the total answer. Just give me a little piece of what's going on here so that I can know. But that doesn't always happen. We don't always have a little peace. And that's where our trust needs to come in, that we're insufficient without God. I think even Jesus kind of brings up this idea in Matthew 19. Matthew 19 records the story of where Jesus is talking with the young man who comes to him and he asks him what he needs to do. And Jesus tells him that he needs to keep the whole law, that he needs to honor his father and mother, not murder, not commit adultery, not steal, not bear false witness, and all those things. And the man says, I've done all these things from my youth. And I think that's a really amazing statement. More amazing is that Jesus doesn't correct it and that he says that. Jesus instead turns to him and he says, you still have one thing that you lack. You need to go and sell all of your possessions and come and follow me. And we know the story of the rich young ruler. He turns away sorrowful because he had great possessions. And imagine being in the apostles' position there, where they've just seen a man come up to Jesus, up to their master, up to their teacher, and ask him what he needs to do. And Jesus goes through all the commandments. You need to do all these things. And the man says, I've done all of those. Imagine the apostles that at that moment are probably thinking, wow, this guy is a righteous guy. He has the key. He's going to be saved. But then he goes away sorrowful. And we get to verse 25, and what's their question in Matthew 19? Who then can be saved? If this guy can't do it, who's kept all of the law from his youth, who can be saved? And Jesus' answer, I think, is really, really encouraging. In verse 26, he says, Jesus looked at them, and he said, with man, it is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. But sometimes things just aren't in our reach. Sometimes we just can't control all of the situations in our life, and that's okay. I would like it to not be that way. I'd like to be able to control everything in my life, but I can't. But it's okay because I know all things are in God's reach. All things are in God's control. God can handle everything, especially my salvation. He can handle that, which is the most important thing. All things are possible with God being salvation, but if I hand things over to God, He is sufficient for the things that are needed to happen in my life. And we need to be aware of that and confessing our insufficiencies there. But then that leads to the last thing. We need to acknowledge our dependence on God. Like what Jehoshaphat says after he says, we don't know what to do. We're insufficient without you. He says, but our eyes are on you. You know, I think we hear that sometimes when life is hard, when life is going difficult, and someone comes and they say to you, you know, I know life is hard, but you just need to look to God. You just need to put your eyes on God. You need to trust in God. And we hear that, and maybe hear a preacher say that. And sometimes we can think, I know that I've thought before, well, that's just what the preacher is supposed to say. You know, he doesn't really get it. That's why he's here. He's supposed to say you're supposed to trust in God. But that doesn't really help. And that can be discouraging. When you read a story that shows a man that says, our eyes are on you, or you hear someone say, you know, I know life is hard, but you just need to put your eyes on God. But they don't really understand. That can be hard. But I think more than that, what's included in that statement is not just we look to God, but that we know who we're looking at. And that's what I want to spend the rest of our time talking about in Isaiah chapter 40, and reminding us of when we have statements like that, when there are hard things in our life that we don't know how to deal with, that we don't know what to do, and someone tells us or reminds us that you need to look to God, what are they really saying? Who are they saying that you really need to look to? Because in Isaiah 40, I love Isaiah 40. The whole chapter we don't have time to read, but God goes through and he's discussing who he is, and he's reminding the people of Israel who he is and what he's capable of and how they need to look to him, right? But I just want to spend time in the last section, in the last few verses. So we'll start in verse 28. In verse 28, he starts off with two rhetorical questions. He says, have you not known? Have you not heard? And I think that's kind of helpful for us, because whenever someone says, you know, you just need to look to God, I know that. I know when life is hard, I'm supposed to look to God. And so it's like, don't you know who God is? Haven't you seen who God is? Haven't you seen what he's capable of? Yes, I think all of us in this room have seen and read about what God is capable of and what he's able to do. But God goes on and he tells the Israelites again anyway. He says, don't you know who God is? Haven't you heard who God is? I'm going to tell you anyway. And it's helpful for us to remind ourselves very often so that we don't forget who the God is that we serve. And so he goes through and he says, have you not known, have you not heard, the Lord is the everlasting God. Number one, the Lord is the everlasting God. He's eternal. He's always been here. He was here from the beginning. He was here before the beginning, and he'll be here after the end. And so what that means for ourselves and our specific situations when life gets hard, there's no problem that we can have that God is not aware of and that God probably hasn't seen before. And he hasn't dealt with before. He's been here for a long time. My dad used to tell me whenever I was growing up and I was having difficulties and making decisions and things like that, he would tell me that I could come and talk to him because he's been there and he's done that. And that was largely true. My dad did a lot of the things that I did growing up, and he helped me not make some of the same mistakes that he made whenever he was growing up. But my dad doesn't know everything. He hasn't seen everything. He hasn't been around. My dad's only been around for about 52 years. That's a long time compared to my 24 years, but he hasn't been around for forever. God's been around for forever. He's always been here. He's seen every problem that everyone has ever had, and if anyone has the answers, it would be the everlasting, eternal God. So that's the first thing. The Lord is the everlasting God, but he's the creator of the ends of the earth as well. He made everything. And so don't you think he knows how all the things work? If he's made it all, that includes you and me. He's made us, and he's made everything in the earth. He knows how it all works. David talks about this in Psalm 18 verse 1, where he says, "The heavens declare your glory." When I love looking at the stars and seeing the stars. Where I grew up in Kentucky, in Louisville, Kentucky, it was kind of in the city, and all the city lights would drown out all of the stars. But where I live at now in Pennsylvania is kind of the middle of nowhere. And so you can go out at night and just look up and see a bunch of stars out in the middle of the country. And among all of those stars, you don't see them at night, but among all those stars in our galaxy is the sun. Do you know how big the sun is? It's massive compared to the earth. You can fit, I think, hundreds of thousands of Earths in the sun. But when you look at the whole galaxy, the sun is very tiny compared to the whole galaxy. And God made all of that. If God is bigger than all of that, he's bigger than all of the problems that are in our lives as well. And so he's created everything, and we need to trust in him because he knows how those work. But he continues in verse 28 of Isaiah 40, and he says, he does not faint or grow weary. That one's hard for me to deal with, and hard for me to understand, because people get tired. All of us get tired, whether we're old, young. There's a point where we run out of energy, where we can't keep going forward. And so this idea that you never faint, you never grow weary, that doesn't seem like a possibility. But with God, that is a possibility, and that's a truth. God never needs to take a nap. He never needs to take a break. He never needs to slow down and recharge. He has all power, and he doesn't have to reset himself in order to deal with the situation. Whereas where I get tired and I faint and I become weary when things get hard in my life, God doesn't. He has the strength to carry through and to be able to handle things that I can't handle in my own life. And then the last phrase that he makes in verse 28 is his understanding is unsearchable. With God, you can never exhaust the reservoir of knowledge that God has. You can't run out of knowledge with God. He never runs out of what he understands. And I think we understand this at a macro level. We understand that God understands how all things work and that he's made all things, and he causes the earth to work together, and how the earth is at a perfect angle and it's on its axis, and all of like the ways that everything is fine-tuned in the universe. But when it comes to a micro level, it gets harder for us to realize that his understanding is unsearchable. When it gets to a micro level with me personally, because that's often what we do. Whenever things get hard, we think no one else understands what I'm going through right now. No one else gets what's happening in my life. But God understands, and he knows. One of my favorite psalms in Psalm 56, David writes this psalm. Psalm 56 in verse 8. He says, "You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book?" What David is saying there is, God, you know the hard things that are going on in my life, and you are aware of those, and you care about them, and you're going to act on them. And so it's no wonder, after reading all of that in Isaiah 40 and verse 28, that God is everlasting, that he's created everything, that he never gets tired, and that he understands all things. It's no wonder that there were so many writings, and then when Jesus came here, and whenever the apostles wrote, like the apostle Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 5, to cast your cares and anxieties on the Lord because he cares for you. It's no wonder, because God understands. He gets it. He knows what we're dealing with, and he's there to help. But what's going on, he doesn't just stop there and describing himself. He describes what he does in his relationship with people. In Isaiah 40 and verse 29, it says, he gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. You know, I gotta say, whenever I read that verse, I love that verse. We sing a song about this in Isaiah 40, that even youths faint and grow weary, even young men stumble and fall, but those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. They'll mount up with wings like eagles. We'll get to that here in a second. But I think that reading that verse in verse 29, he gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. I gotta tell you, I think that is the second most beautiful thing in the entire universe. I think the most beautiful thing in the entire universe is that this God would forgive me and would forgive everyone, would forgive us of what we've done. Because we've fallen short, we've sinned, we've done what we wanted to do, we've gone our own way, as Isaiah 53 says. But the beautiful thing is God didn't abandon us. God would have had, I think, every single right to abandon the world. To just say, fine, if you don't want me, you don't need me. And I'm not gonna stick around and just destroy it all. We sing that song. He could have called 10,000 angels. He could have just destroyed the whole thing. He could have destroyed you and me, but he didn't. He sent his son to come and die and to forgive us of our sins so that we can have a relationship with him. That is the single most beautiful truth in the entire universe, that God wants to have a relationship with us, and that relationship is possible. But I think number two, for me at least, is that God wants to share his power with me when I need it. Because God knows that I can't do life by myself, that I can't handle certain situations in my life, that there are going to be some questions, that there are going to be times when I don't know what to do. But God says, you can have some of my power to get through them. He will give his power to the faint, to those who don't have strength. He will increase their might. He goes on in verse 30, even youth shall faint and be weary, young men shall fall exhausted, but those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. You know, that's kind of the catch. Those who wait on the Lord will renew their strength. That's kind of the catch with God. God doesn't force his power or his peace on anyone. He says, if you want it, you need to come and wait on the Lord for that. You need to trust in the Lord. You need to put your faith in the Lord. Or like Jehoshaphat says in his prayer, put your eyes on the Lord. Our eyes are on you. Because you realize these attributes about God, who God is, who you're actually waiting for. He's been around for forever, and he can handle any problem that you have if you just trust in him. I like in 2 Peter chapter 1, Peter will talk about how we need to add to our faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and knowledge self-control, and we need to keep growing in that. And in the last couple verses of his book, he says we need to grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ, grow in our faith of what we've had. That's a huge theme in the Bible, and a huge theme in the New Testament of what Christians are supposed to do. No matter what happens in your life, trials, tribulations, or difficulties, or things you don't know, keep growing in your faith to God. Another word, I think, for faith that's a fair translation of that is keep growing in your trust of God, in trusting who he is. Because when you wait on something, when you have faith in something, when you trust in something, one of the attributes of that thing is you trust that you can put your weight on that thing. A really real practical example of that, whenever I was in college, I hurt my knee, I blew my knee out and tore, I think, 3 or 4 ligaments in my knee, and had to get reconstructive surgery for that. And I was in a wheelchair for about 2 months, and then on crutches for I think 3 or 4 months after that, and going through rehab and trying to retrain myself how to walk. And one of the most difficult parts of retraining myself how to walk is to really trust that I could put the full weight of my body on my right leg again. Because for such a long time, I couldn't. I just didn't have the capability. My muscles had atrophied, they weren't there. I didn't have that. And I had to train myself to trust that my leg can support my weight. I think Christians need to constantly be doing that with God, to train ourselves to trust that God can support our weight. He's very capable of doing that. He has the ability to do that. He has the capability to do that if we just trust him and cast our anxieties on him. And so when we get over to the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 12, this will be the last verse that we read together. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, after the Hebrew author has just gone through chapter 11, what we sometimes refer to as the Hall of Faith,
and all these great men and women of faith who trusted in God. And because of their trust in God, they went and did the things that God told them to do. And so you have people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebecca, and you have Samson and a bunch of different other people that God mentions here, or that the author mentions here. And he talks about those who were mistreated, killed with the sword, sawn in two, that went through all of these afflictions in chapter 11. And he turns back to his audience in chapter 12. And he says in chapter 12, verse 1, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted." I like that in verse 3. One of the purposes of why Jesus came, of why God gave the power that he gave to us, that we read about in Isaiah 40, one of those reasons is so that we would not grow weary or faint-hearted. Because isn't that what happens in our lives a lot of times? Something hard happens and we don't know what to do, and our reaction is to get weary and faint-hearted. And I think if we just remember what Jehoshaphat remembered, that when things are hard, when we're powerless, when we don't know what to do, if we just put our eyes on God and remember who God is, what he's capable of, we don't have to be weary or faint-hearted. That doesn't mean the problems will go away. That doesn't mean life will be cake. That doesn't mean life will be easy. But it means that we'll be able to get through it with God's power, no matter what situation that it is. And so I hope that that's helpful in talking about that this morning with you all. I don't know personally if there's anything that anyone personally is going through that's just, you don't know what to do, or maybe as a group there's something don't know what to do. Those things happen in our lives, and God doesn't say that they will go away if we trust in him, but he does say that he will help us get through this, and we can trust in those promises that God has. And so if you need to respond to the gospel, if you need to give your life to God, or if you need to come back to him, or you need the prayers of the church here, or you need any kind of help this morning, you can come forward and talk to me about that while we stand and sing the song of invitation.
Number 397. Brightly beams our Father's mercy from the